How does a person punish themselves? Marlon Brando's answer was simple. Build a cell in the middle of paradise and never leave. Tahiti is one of the most beautiful places in the world. Turquoise waters, white sands, a tropical dream. Brando had escaped there, from Hollywood, from fame, from pain. His 12-room mansion could have accommodated his family. Guests could have come and gone. He could have lived a peaceful retirement. But Brando chose just one room and didn't leave it for 20 years. Why? Because his son Christian had killed a man, and Brando held himself responsible. Because his daughter Cheyenne had hanged herself, and Brando hadn't been able to save her. Because he had seen what happened to Maria Schneider on the set of Last Tango in Paris, but had remained silent. The broken mirrors were instruments of punishment. Every time he looked at them, he hated himself. The 47 bottles of medication were attempts at numbing, but his conscience wouldn't sleep. The words on the walls were court transcripts. Brando was the prosecutor, the defendant, and the jury. And the verdict was the same every day. Guilty. When the cleaning crew entered that room, it felt more like a crime scene than a funeral home, because a murder had been committed there. Brando had killed his own soul. If you're curious about the rest of this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Because the truth behind the 20 years Brando spent in that room has barely begun to be told. It all began on that May night in 1990. Actually, no, it had begun much earlier. But that night was the point of no return. There was a family gathering at Marlon Brando's home in Los Angeles. His son Christian, his sister Cheyenne, and Cheyenne's boyfriend, Dag Drolle. It should have been a normal dinner, but nothing was normal in the Brando family. Christian arrived drunk. Cheyenne had bruises on her face, and Dag seemed relaxed, too relaxed. Brando was watching TV in the living room, thinking everything was under control. Then Christian went upstairs. He entered his father's bedroom. He opened the drawer. He took the .45 pistol. He came downstairs with the gun in his hand and something in his eyes that Brando knew very well. The same fear of looking in the mirror, the same self-loathing, the same loss of control. Christian pulled the trigger while Dag was sitting on the couch. One shot. Dag's head fell back. Cheyenne screamed. And when Brando came running, the scene he saw would change his life forever. His son standing with a gun in his hand. His beloved daughter's boyfriend lying on the floor covered in blood. And only silence everywhere. That silence would follow Brando all the way to Tahiti. The trial was a nightmare. Christian was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The media went wild. Godfather's son is a killer. Headlines were everywhere. Brando attended the hearings, defended his son, shed tears. But a voice inside him whispered something else. This is your fault. You raised him this way. You were never there. You were always in another movie, with another woman, in another world. And now a man is dead. When they took Christian to prison, Brando sat in the car and didn't move for hours. The driver was worried, but Brando just stared out the window. No one knew what was going through his mind. But a few weeks later, he went to Tahiti and never truly returned. He bought a mansion, moved his belongings, and chose one of the 12 rooms, the smallest one, the darkest one. And he closed the door. But the story didn't end there. While Christian was in prison, Cheyenne fell apart. Her already fragile mental health completely collapsed. Her father supported Christian, but couldn't devote enough time to Cheyenne. She felt guilty if she hadn't been with Dag, if they hadn't gone there that night, if she hadn't shown Christian the bruises on her face. Brando flew from Tahiti to Los Angeles from time to visit his daughter, but he ignored the emptiness in her eyes. In 1995, Cheyenne went to her mother's house in Tahiti. She was 25 years old. On the morning of April 16, 1995, her mother found her hanging in her room. There was no suicide note. There was only an old photograph of Marlon Brando in her room at her father's house. She had written something in pencil on the back of the photo. "Why didn't you see me?" Brando received the news at his mansion in Tahiti. The phone rang. It was his brother calling, and when Brando answered, he knew from the tone of his voice. Cheyenne was dead. Words failed him. The man who delivered some of the greatest speeches in cinema history couldn't utter a word in the face of his own daughter's death. He put down the phone, went out into the living room, and stood in the middle of the 12-room house. Which room should he go to? The guest room was empty. The kitchen was unused. The bedrooms were gathering dust. There was only one room, that small dark room in the corner. He walked to the door, went inside, and closed it. He never opened it again. Meals were left outside the door. Neighbors sometimes heard noises at night, crying, screaming, or just the wind. No one knew. But one thing was certain. Brando had locked himself in that room, and his punishment was just beginning. But why was he punishing himself so severely? Weren't Christian's murder and Cheyenne's suicide horrific enough? There was something else on Brando's mind. A shadow from 1972. Last Tango in Paris. That film had brought Brando a career renaissance, but it had also burdened him with a weight he couldn't bear. Maria Schneider was 19. Brando was 48. Director Bernardo Bertolucci suddenly presented them with that famous scene. Artificial moaning would be used. Maria Schneider wasn't prepared. The camera would roll. Brando performed the scene. Maria cried. Real tears. Most of the crew was uncomfortable, but no one stopped it. The film was finished, released, and caused a scandal. Maria Schneider carried the trauma of that scene for years. In 2007, she recounted in interviews, "I felt like I had been raped." Brando never apologized. Brando remained silent. He never made a statement. But on the walls of that room in Tahiti, among the writings found by the cleaning crew, was one that read, "Maria, I knew." He knew. He knew what was happening while that scene was being filmed. He could have asked for the camera to stop, but he didn't. Because he was method acting, he was chasing reality, he was sacrificing small people for the sake of great art. And now, years later, with his own children dead, that scene came back to him. Maybe that's why he hadn't seen Cheyenne. Maybe that's why he couldn't be a father to Christian. Because he had learned very well to ignore the pain of others. That room wasn't just a physical prison. It was the prison of Brando's mind. Every night when he lay down in bed, he saw Maria's tears. Every morning when he woke up, he saw the gun in Christian's hand. Every noon when he looked out the window, he imagined Cheyenne's hanging body. The drugs were supposed to silence these ghosts. 47 different drugs. Antidepressants, anxiolytics, sleeping pills, painkillers. Doctors wrote the prescriptions, but Brando determined the doses himself. Sometimes he took too much. Sometimes he took nothing. He had lost control and was relishing the loss of control. Because control was an illusion. What had he ever controlled in his life? He had controlled characters: Stanley Kowalski, Terry Malloy, Vito Corleone. But he had never controlled his own life. His marriages, his children, his addictions, even his own body. 20 years from 1984 to 2004. 7,300 days. Every day in that room. As the light faded, Brando faded too. His weight increased. 140 pounds, then 160, then more. He developed diabetes. Heart problems began, but he refused to see a doctor. The servants were worried, but Brando kept them at a distance. Just leave the food and go. The plates came back empty, but Brando wasn't losing weight. It was said that he would go down to the kitchen in the middle of the night and empty the refrigerator. Loneliness was eating him, and he was eating loneliness. Mirrors were broken because Brando could no longer look at himself. The young Brando, that handsome, athletic, magnetic man from Streetcar, was gone, replaced by a fat, sick, lonely ghost. Each broken mirror shard was a memory. He remembered Broadway nights, Oscar ceremonies, the day he first arrived in Tahiti. Young, free, still clean. Now, when he looked in the mirror, he saw a monster, and the monster was laughing at him. The walls were covered in writing. The cleaning crew took photos, but the family had them all destroyed. Still, some words leaked out. I could have been. He never wrote the rest of that famous line. The word father was repeated hundreds of times, in different inks, on different days. The word sorry was written over 200 times on one wall. To whom? To Christian? To Cheyenne? To Maria? To all of them. Brando talked to the walls because no one else was listening. Sometimes he wrote poems, bad poems, incomprehensible verses, but all with the same theme. Loss. What had he lost? Everything. His talent, his family, his honor, himself. He was known as the greatest actor, but he had lost his real role, the role of being human. The summer of 2004 was hot. Every summer is hot in Tahiti, but that summer was special. Brando's health was deteriorating. He had trouble breathing, his chest hurt, but still, he didn't leave that room. On July 1st, breakfast was left outside the door, lunch too, dinner too, but the plates weren't opened. The maid became concerned, knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked louder. Still silence. They called the police. The police came and broke down the door. Inside, Marlon Brando was lying in his bed. His eyes were closed. He wasn't breathing. He had died at the age of 80. Of natural causes, heart failure. But those who entered that room knew it wasn't natural. It was a slow suicide, a death spread over 20 years. His body died that day, but his spirit had died long before. Perhaps the night Christian pulled the trigger. Maybe the morning Cheyenne hanged herself. Maybe the moment Maria cried on the set of Last Tango. Maybe even earlier when Brando first looked in the mirror and didn't like what he saw. The cleanup process began. The coffin was prepared. The funeral was planned. But first, the room had to be cleaned. When the crew entered, the first thing they noticed was the smell of medicine, sweat, decay. The windows hadn't been opened in 20 years. Then their eyes drifted to the walls. Words, words, words. Some scrawled with a pen, some with paint, some with fingernail marks. Broken mirrors piled in the corners. They counted 17. 47 medicine bottles, some full, some empty, some half full. They found a notebook under the bed. The pages were torn, but a few sentences were legible. If there is a God, may he forgive me, because I will never forgive myself. On another page, acting was easy, living was hard. And the last page, Christian, Cheyenne, Maria, I will see you, but I won't be able to look you in the face. The family had the notebook burned. The writing on the walls was painted over. The mirrors were thrown away. The drugs were destroyed. That room was erased. Not physically, but from memory, because they didn't want Brando's legacy to be remembered that way. Today, Marlon Brando is remembered as one of the greatest actors in history, the father of method acting. 2 Oscars, 8 nominations, Streetcar, Waterfront, Godfather, some of cinema history's most iconic performances. But those who knew the Tahiti room tell a different story. Brando wasn't just an actor, he was also a father, and he failed. He was a man, and he suffered. He was a human being, and he was lost. That room was his final performance. A performance without an audience, a finale without applause. And when the curtain fell, all that remained were words, broken glass, and empty medicine bottles. 47 bottles, each a failed attempt at sedation, each a sleepless night, each a moment of guilt. What was Brando searching for in that room? Forgiveness? Peace? Oblivion? Perhaps he found none of these. Perhaps what he was searching for was himself, the young, ambitious, talented Marlon Brando he had lost. But that Marlon was long dead. What remained was a shadow, and shadows flee from the sun. Tahiti's sun was too bright. So Brando took refuge in that dark room. He lived in darkness for 20 years, and he died in darkness. Now tourists visit Tahiti. The island is paradise. But Brando's mansion was never sold. It still stands there, a 12-room house. And that little corner room, no matter how much it's been painted and cleaned, still whispers. The walls talk. The broken mirrors are still there, though invisible to the eye. And sometimes at night, neighbors swear they hear sounds, the sound of a man crying. Or perhaps it was just the sound of ocean waves. Marlon Brando is dead, but that room lives on. Because that room was not just 4 walls, it was a conscience, a prison, a confession room. And now that Brando is gone, the questions remain. How much pain can a person bear? When do they lose the right to be forgiven? And most importantly, where do those who cannot forgive themselves go? Brando's answer was clear. They go to that little room in Tahiti, and there they wait for 20 years. Not for death. They were waiting to be forgiven, but forgiveness never came.